Hey folks, this is Astus back again with a Baldur's Gate 3 tier list video. In this video, I will be ranking every cantrip in the game. My intention is to do this for every level of spell, right up to 6th level spells. So this will be part 1 of a series that I hope you like. Now, if you didn't know, I have actually ranked all of these cantrips in early access over a year ago. I covered early access extensively, and I wrote probably what I'm best known for in early access. My most popular thing was a spell tier list that is still up on my website. I think cantrips through 2nd level spells, and then I had 3rd level spells for my Patreon supporters. Anyways, even though all of the cantrips in full release were ones that we had in early access, a lot has changed in full release. And so my thoughts and rankings of these cantrips have changed as well. So if you were an old fan of my spell tier list, things have changed now, so I hope you like this. First, very quick thing about my tier system. I do want to introduce this for all of the spell tier lists that I will be doing in the future. So I use a 5-tier system, S, A, B, C, and RP. For spells, S tier stands for a spell or cantrip that is consistently amazing. I use it all the time, and it's extremely good. That's S tier. A tier is a spell that can be situationally amazing or consistently good. B tier, likewise, is the tier for situationally good spells and cantrips or consistently average spells and cantrips. C tier is for spells and cantrips that are mostly overshadowed by their competitors. Maybe there's a niche circumstance or build where this cantrip can be worth using, but it's so niche, you can pretty much ignore these and you won't be losing that much. And then finally, RP tier. RP stands for roleplay tier. This is for spells and cantrips that really have no niche as far as tactics and optimization goes, but I recognize that there are valid reasons for picking spells that aren't just optimization, and RP tier is for those. Okay, I hope that's a good idea of what the tiers are. You guys will probably get a pretty good idea of my thoughts on these tiers as we go. So now let's dive into this list, starting with Acid Splash. I'm putting Acid Splash in C tier. It is a save attack cantrip. If you don't know what that means, attack cantrips are any cantrip that is supposed to replace an attack that's supposed to do damage, basically. And attack cantrips come in 2 varieties. There are spell attack cantrips, which are just like making an attack roll, except they use your spell ability modifier to hit, not to damage, though. You need special feats and things to actually start adding your spellcasting modifier to the damage of cantrips. Save attack cantrips also deal damage, but instead of making an attack roll, you actually force a saving throw on the enemy, and if they fail, they will take the damage. If they succeed, they don't take half. With spells that aren't cantrips, they usually do take half, but not with cantrips. And that actually puts save attack spells at a pretty severe disadvantage because they can't crit because they aren't an attack roll. No one can critically fail a saving throw, right? So you're never getting that added damage from crits, and then also you're not getting that guaranteed half damage if they succeed on the save, and it kind of leaves them in this not very good tier as far as damage goes. Now, Acid Splash is the only area of effect cantrip, I believe. It deals 1d6 acid damage if enemies fail a dexterity save in a small AoE. And that's it. It's just the damage is low. The fact that its area of effect isn't really helping it for me. I definitely prefer higher single target damage than lower area of effect damage, because kind of the point of damage is to kill enemies and cancel their turns. And that usually means focusing down one enemy at a time. Doesn't mean there isn't a place for area of effect damage, but yeah, in low damage and cantrip form, I almost never cast this. You can pretty much ignore the spell, and that's C tier for me. Next up is Blade Ward. Blade Ward is going in B tier. So this is a defensive self buff. When you cast it for the next 2 turns, you have resistance to physical damage, that is slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning damage. This can be situationally good if you are expecting to take a lot of physical damage in the next 2 turns. So it's always useful for that. But you can also make kind of builds around this in combination with retaliation damage spells, like in particular Armor of Agathis. That is the main one. This cantrip synergizes extremely well with Armor of Agathis, but there's also other ones like Flame Shield, for example. We're going to be covering all of them once I do each spell level tier list. So yeah, it mixes really good with those, but so yeah, I would say consistently average, situationally quite good. The situation is if you kind of build around it and mix it with those retaliation damage spells, definitely worth taking. Next up is Chill Touch. Chill Touch is going into A tier, and this is a really good way for me to introduce kind of the way I am ranking these attack cantrips. So Chill Touch is a spell attack cantrip. So it's actually making an attack roll. It deals 1d8 necrotic damage, and then it also marks a target where for the next round they cannot receive any healing. I mean, they can get healed, but it doesn't actually heal them, right? So a lot of attack cantrips are going to be like this, where they deal 1d8 damage-ish, and then they have an added effect. And if the added effect is good, I will usually rank them in A. Whereas if they're just a flat attack cantrip that doesn't have very many added effects, I'm going to put them around B tier. That's basically how I'm doing this. So the added effect on Chill Touch, 1d8 is decent damage, and then canceling healing is actually quite good. Although there aren't a lot of enemies that really abuse healing in this game. There is at least one that I use this against. It's the Lava Elemental in Grimforge. It heals a lot. I like to just attack it from high ground where it cannot reach me with a combination of Chill Touch and Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost deals double damage against it, that's why. And then the Chill Touch stops it from healing, and you can just whittle it down safely and turn a difficult encounter into one that actually takes 0 resources. So it's at least one fight that it's useful on. But there are others, I'm sure, and it's still a decent attack cantrip, even without the added benefit. Actually, I think it has a third added benefit of you get advantage against undead with this. Let me just check that. Sorry, I misremembered that. If you use this on undead for the next round, they also have disadvantage on their attack rolls. There's quite a few undead in this game, so yeah, both those added benefits are incredible. This is one of the best attack cantrips for its added effects. Next up, Dancing Lights. Dancing Lights going into C tier. This takes concentration and an action to cast, and it illuminates an area. Illuminating an area can be good if you do not have members on your team that have dark vision, which for me is likely. I value a lot of races that don't have dark vision, like halflings, for example. So for them, whereas they would normally be attacking with disadvantage, this removes that disadvantage, and that is quite good. And also there's some enemies in the game where you need to illuminate an area, otherwise they disappear, and it is good against them. The problem is that there's a lot of ways to illuminate an area, and this is the most action economy intensive one in the game. It's taking both your action and your concentration slot, and that is just too expensive for what it offers you compared to its competitors. So almost no reason to cast this. I could put it into RP tier, but there are some very niche circumstances where it's worth it, so it's going on the low end of C tier for me. Next up is Eldritch Blast. Eldritch Blast is going into S tier. It's one of the best cantrips in the game because it's actually, strangely, one of the best weapons in the game. Now, I've explained this in a lot of my videos, so I'll just touch on this very quickly. Eldritch Blast is a spell attack cantrip that does 1d10 force damage. What makes it different from a lot of other spell attack cantrips is its scaling. Now, cantrips will scale in damage. Attack ones will scale in damage as you level. I believe they gain an extra damage dice at level 5 and then again at level 10. It's level 10 in BG3. I think it's level 11 in Tabletop, but I'm pretty confident it's level 10 in Baldur's Gate 3. If I'm wrong about that, you guys can let me know in the comments. Eldritch Blast scales differently At level 5 and 10, instead of adding a damage dice, it's actually going to add a whole other ray. And each ray is its own attack roll that deals damage. So you're getting that damage dice, but you're making more attacks to get that damage dice. And that's really good because of the opportunity to stack damage on hit. And that's what makes the scaling on Eldritch Blast so incredible. That and its synergy with Sorcerer's Quicken spell. But yeah, if you're a Warlock, if you have Potent Robe, if you have a certain late game staff, which I'll be covering soon in my top 10 items in Act 3, all of these add damage on hit to your spells, and Eldritch Blast has 3 rays by late game, 2 by early mid, to stack up all of those effects. It's just really, really an amazing spell, and it works on so many classes because there's so many charisma casters on this game. Bards, Warlocks, and Sorcerers all benefit from Eldritch Blast. So, S tier easily. I have said and I maintain that it is actually the best attack strategy in the game. Next up is Firebolt. Firebolt is going into B tier. Now, I know a lot of you are going to be mad about that because you probably use Firebolt a lot. It's a spell attack cantrip that does 1d10 fire damage, which is the highest damage you can get on a cantrip, tied with Eldritch Blast and Shocking Grasp, which we'll talk about later. You can also use this to blow things up, like explosive barrels, for example, and it is good for that. However, there are a lot of ways of blowing up barrels. You can just throw Alchemist Fires, for example, or cast other fire spells. I do not think it is necessary to blow things up. I regularly blow things up without it. So, besides that, it's just a 1d10 fire spell attack cantrip. And that is just consistently average to me. That's not really an attack strategy worth building around. It's just kind of a mediocre way to spend an action if you don't want to waste a spell slot in a fight. So, that has to be B tier for me. Firebolt is B tier. Next up is Friends. Friends is going into A tier. So, this is a outside of combat kind of social cantrip. You can cast it to gain advantage on any charisma check. However, some enemies, especially in higher difficulties, they will know that you tried to charm them, and they can become aggressive because of that. So you don't want to just spam this. However, there are so many encounters in this game where a charisma check can allow you to completely bypass a fight, including boss fights. This happens a lot, especially in Act 2. So you want to use Friends for those checks, because if you fail them, you're going to be in a fight anyways. So you might as well just go for it, right? So yeah, it's really good for that. And just getting advantage on some of the best outside of combat skill checks in the game that actually have impact for combat. It sounds unusual, but this is what I call indirect combat utility, where you're not using it directly in combat, but it is because it's allowing you to bypass combats. It is actually indirectly useful for them. So yeah, it's one of the best for that. Really, really quite good utility spell. Next up on our list is Guidance. Guidance is going into S tier. This is the best utility skill check spell in the game. You literally just should spam this all game long. It's absolutely incredible. If you don't know, it's giving you an extra 1d4 on your skill checks. So, not really useful in combat, but its indirect combat utility is immense. It's going into S tier easily. I don't think that will be controversial. I'm also putting Light into S tier. This one might be controversial, but the thing about Light is it's basically free from an action economy perspective. It takes an action to cast, but it lasts like 99 turns or something. Maybe they've even fixed it to be until your next long rest. So what you do is you just cast this on an ally who does not have dark vision, and now they have dark vision, and it costs nothing. I mean, it's not exactly like dark vision, right? It's illuminating them, and the radius isn't that wide, so it works best on melee strikers rather than ranged strikers. But still, it's just a really great way to bypass the disadvantage on attack rolls for a whole type of unit that you're probably going to have in your party, and that's just so useful for action economy free. So that's so useful. It has to go into a S tier for me. And it's one of the reasons why I don't value Dark Vision that much. If just a free cantrip is bypassing the negatives from darkness, it's not really that good, right? Next up is Mage Hand. I'm putting Mage Hand at the high end of A tier. I use this a lot to bypass certain puzzles of the game. Not bypass them, it just solves certain puzzles in the game. And you can solve them without Mage Hand. It's just tedious and sometimes not as reliable. So yeah, Mage Hand's awesome. In combat, not really great. There was a time in early access where I would use Mage Hand in combat, but that time is long past. Now it's just an out-of-combat way to solve puzzles, but it's so good for that. It's the quality of life on the spell is amazing, so yeah, I consider it A tier. Minor Illusion. Minor Illusion's going into S tier. I'm not sure where to put it here. Maybe behind Guidance. So this is weird. When you cast a spell, it'll create like a little distraction and NPCs will gather around it. And it's a great strategy for stealthing past encounters. I'd say it's just a good strategy for that because sometimes you can group them up, distract them with that cone of vision, and then quickly run past. But the more useful thing about it is to group enemies up before you start combat so that you can start combat with a big AoE spell. Grouping enemies up like that can mean high efficiency on your AoE attacks. And yeah, that's really high impact in fights. I mean, technically, if you're playing super optimally, you'll want to begin every fight you can with Minor Illusion, right? Now, I don't do that just because you don't really need to do that to reliably clear fights, but I'm saying it just to express how good it actually is. It's giving you a serious edge, and there really isn't anything these other cantrips can do to compete with that. So, yeah, Minor Illusion's S tier. Next up is Poison Spray. Poison Spray is going into C tier. I put it maybe there. Poison Spray is a single target save attack cantrip that actually deals 1d12 poison damage. Now, 1d12 is the highest damage dice that a cantrip deals. And remember, you're adding damage dice as this scale. So by late game, this is 3d12 poison damage. And that has a lot of potential. I think of builds all the time where I really want to utilize this. Oh, by the way, it's a Constitution save to resist. Constitution's one of the easiest saves to debuff. With the combination of reverberation and bleeding, you can pretty much hit this guaranteed. And 1d12 is a lot, so it's honestly looking pretty good to me, except the fact that it's poison damage, and there are a fair amount of enemies in this game that either resist or are completely immune to poison damage, and that is a big bummer. However, isn't this good enough to go into situationally good? I'm not sure. For now, I am putting it in C tier. I'm just kind of trusting my instincts on this one. I could see myself bumping it up to B tier in the future. So I'm putting in the high end of C tier for that reason. Next up is Produce Flame. Produce Flame is going into B tier. It's kind of like Firebolt, except it does 1d8 damage and it has slightly less range, but it also has an illuminating effect on yourself, kind of like the light spell. But if you want a fire attack cantrip, you're probably better off going Firebolt. If you want to illuminate, you're probably better off going light. Now, there are some classes in the game, I think it's Cleric or Druid, that get Produce Flame, and they don't get access to Firebolt, so for them it's good. But yeah, I can't see myself ever making it better than Firebolt, so it's going to be behind Firebolt in B tier. Next up is Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost is up here. It's an A tier cantrip that deals 1d8 cold damage. Now, it being cold damage already puts it into A tier because you can very easily force vulnerability to cold damage on enemies, either through the chilled condition or more likely the wet condition from the first level spell Create Water. So you're likely to double the damage on Ray of Frost compared to other ones like Chill Touch or Firebolt, for example. And then it has the added effect of taking away 2 units of movement from an enemy. So that's 3 meters if you do meters, it's 10 feet if you do feet. So it kind of has this automatic kiting effect to it, which is really useful. So great damage dealing cantrip because it's cold damage. Great extra added effect. You're pretty much always getting value out of the reduced movement. Fantastic. yeah, definitely one of the better ones, but solidly in the consistently good tier, the A tier for me. So I would love to put an S, but there really isn't a situation where it's amazing. It's just always kind of good, right? So that is Ray of Frost. Next up is Resistance. Resistance is going into B tier, C tier as well. So this is a buff, which is kind of like Guidance, except it's adding 1d4 to your saving throws. And I know what you're thinking, like, that sounds pretty good, except it's an action, and it's single target, so you have to predict who's going to have to make a saving throw. It does last actually kind of a while. I believe it's 10 turns. So you can pre-buff with this, but I pretty much never pre-buff. I just find it so tedious. I just pretend that pre-buffing doesn't exist, mostly for these tier list videos. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's actually good. I should put it in to B tier. It might even deserve higher than that, but I honestly just so seldom use it. Just, I guess, for the tedium factor. I don't know. You guys let me know. Am I being unfair? Are you all using Resistance and getting a ton of value out of it? Let me know in the comments. Next up is Sacred Flame. I'm putting Sacred Flame also in B tier. I'll probably put it above here, which is maybe controversial. So Sacred Flame is a save attack cantrip. It targets the Dexterity saving throw, and it deals 1d8 radiant damage. And you're probably thinking, that sounds very unimpressive. The thing I like about this is that it's dealing radiant damage. You can use it to stack. You can use it to stack Radiating Orb, basically. There's also some enemies in this game that are vulnerable to radiant damage. So even though, you know, on paper, it should be like C tier because it's really not that good of a cantrip, I actually use it in-game often and I get a lot of value out of it. So I'm bumping it up to B tier for Sacred Flame. Next up is Shillelagh. Shillelagh's going into A tier. This is weird. It functions kind of like an attack cantrip, but it's actually a buff. So this is a bonus action to cast, and it enchants a club or quarterstaff that you are wielding, and it turns the damage of that club or quarterstaff into 1d8, and it uses the wisdom modifier to attack, but I don't think it uses it for damage. It's been a few runs. I definitely have the answer to that. If you look this up on my website, it will confirm that, but I'm pretty sure if my memory's right, it only adds it to your attack rolls. So adding wisdom to your attack rolls is actually very interesting when you can combine it with the ability drain tadpole power. You can use it to gain an extra, albeit very slow way of debuffing enemy wisdom saves, but still that's interesting. I mean, usually cantrips aren't giving you much, so debuffing a wisdom save has a lot of potential. Yeah, and then especially early game, it's like a bonus action cantrip. You only need to cast once to get the value from it, right? So you can invest in wisdom and still actually do a fair amount of melee damage. So yeah, it's pretty good. Overall value is low, but you can kind of build around it. So for that reason, I'm willing to bump it up into A tier for Shillelagh. Next up is Shocking Grasp. Shocking Grasp is amazing. It's probably the best attack cantrip that isn't Eldritch Blast. So it is a 1d10 spell attack cantrip that's actually melee range. I think it's the only melee range spell attack cantrip. 1d10 damage is great for a cantrip. It is lightning damage. That means you can double it against wet targets. Amazing. And it has two added effects. One of them is that enemies that you hit with it become shocked, which means they are unable to take reactions for 1 round. The second added effect is actually what makes it really interesting to me, which is it has advantage on attack rolls against armored creatures. And there's a fair amount of sometimes very difficult enemies in this game that count as armored. You get advantage on your attack rolls against them. So advantage and double damage against wet targets, this actually starts to get into competitive damage ranges that you might even want to quicken cast it. So yeah, I mean, it's no Eldritch Blast, but it's the second best attack cantrip in terms of raw damage. So for that, I'm putting it into A tier. Next up is Thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is another amazing outside of combat social skill buff. So what this does is it gives you advantage on performance and deception checks And yep, those are, especially in the Waning Moon encounter in Act 2, if you guys know what I'm talking about. Performance checks and deception checks become really important. You can just talk your way out of a boss fight that's almost guaranteed to take away some big resources. So just even if you just use it for that, it deserves A tier in my opinion, but it's useful in so many other ways as well. So yeah, it's kind of like Friends. It's definitely in the same area as Friends. Not as useful as Guidance. So yeah, A tier. Next up is Thorn Whip. Thorn Whip is going into A tier as well. It is a spell attack cantrip that does 1d6 piercing damage. Now, late game, there are definitely ways to force vulnerability to piercing damage, so you can double it, but you're never super using this for its damage. What it's good for is its added effect, which is one of the best in the game. This will pull enemies 2 movement units towards you, so that's 3 meters or 10 feet, and you use this to pull people into persistent area of effect, crowd control, or damage clouds. Basically, you use it to get extra ticks of damage or crowd control, and for that it is incredible. You can also use this to pull enemies off of cliffs. It doesn't happen a ton, but it happens enough. And yeah, it can just be an instant kill if you hit this. So that's solidly, situationally amazing. That's A tier for Thorn Whip. Next up is True Strike. True Strike is going into RP tier. This is basically never worth casting. Yeah, it's such a disappointing spell. It's so bad I can barely even remember what it does. Right, yeah, it actually, I just went and read it. It functions like a debuff, which is weird. So you cast this on an enemy, and for the next 2 turns, you have advantage on your attack rolls against that enemy, but it's an action to cast. The thing is that by mid-game especially, there are so many ways to get advantage on your attacks that aren't taking a whole action. Even early game, it isn't even worth doing. It's RP tier. I don't think anyone will disagree with me on that. What am I saying? This is YouTube. Someone will definitely disagree with me on that. But I firmly believe that True Strike is never worth casting. Last one on our list is Vicious Mockery. This is a Bard exclusive cantrip, although you can get it with feats if you want it on other classes. I'm putting this in A tier. So Vicious Mockery is a save attack cantrip. Targets the Wisdom saving throw and does 1d4 psychic damage, which is the lowest damage on an attack cantrip in the game. You're basically never using this for damage. What you're using it for is the added effect, which is if an enemy fails its saving throw against it, it has disadvantage on its attack rolls. So it's a debuff, right? Late game especially, enemies can make multiple attacks in a turn. Imposing disadvantage on their attack rolls for a round is actually quite valuable, but it's also an enchantment spell, which is pretty cool because late game with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, this gives you a reliable use of your bonus action to debuff and deal a little bit of psychic damage. You can combine this with the Brain Drain Gloves to brain drain targets on a bonus action with the Band of Mystic Scoundrel as well. So build-wise, you can actually do quite a bit with it. Yeah, so I believe I'm actually bumping this up. I had it like in C tier in early access, but yeah, I'm bumping it up to A tier because of its interaction with certain items in the game, like I just mentioned. And this is it, our final list. A little bit top heavy, but I'm pretty happy with the distribution. Now I know many of you are going to disagree with me, and I welcome your thoughts in the comments. If there's something I missed, like an interaction that I missed, I would love to hear those. I've played this game a lot, but there's definitely a lot of things I don't know. And the community is really great for educating me on things like that. So yes, I welcome all of those comments. It's funny, in real life, I think I know what the cantrip guidance feels like. You know, the cantrip that's always got your back in all of those skill checks, because I have a group of guys who've always got my back, my supporters on Patreon. Guys, thank you so much for your support. I could not do it without you, seriously. Even if you just chipped in $1 for 1 month, it does mean a lot. To my S tier patrons, Alcaris, Marchitar, Root 1, Todd, Aurelian, and of course the guy who started it all, CA Castaway. Gentlemen, I won't let you down.